Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Dr. Richard Arjun Kaul, and today's date is July the 2nd, 2015. And this afternoon, I'm going to be talking about a topic that might seem a little bit esoteric, but in fact is really just about communication, which is something that's fundamental to our human existence. And it's about the issue of what we refer to as telepathy, which in simple terms is being able to communicate with another human being without the use of words or signals. So it's just the mind of one person communicating with the mind of another person. Now, as you can imagine, the scientific community, of which I could be considered one, having come from a science and medical background, and one, think it's all a bunch of hodgepodge. There's no scientific evidence to support telepathy, and that it's something associated with people on the periphery of society, and there's some truth to that. However, the scientific model of Western society is in and of itself flawed in certain ways, and so the way that we gather knowledge is a consequence of the investigative tools that we have, and as those tools become more sophisticated, the more knowledge that we can gather. So the scientific community has its opinion about certain things, and in the discussion of telepathy, they admittedly don't have the same types of scientific data that the scientific community expects or uses to prove or disprove certain theories. However, there's a very famous theoretical physicist by the name of Amit Goswami, and I think I've talked about him before, and he's a fascinating individual. He was born in Calcutta and came to the States, and there was a documentary made about his life called The Quantum Activist, which I suggest everybody try and watch. And in the documentary, he talks about consciousness, and he's trying to, what he does, explain very well what constitutes consciousness. And very simply, it's energy. And theoretical physicists used to, most of them understand energy as either a particle or a wave, or a combination of the two. So he says that consciousness is essentially a collection of energy. It's in a way it's like it's water. It's like it's completely malleable. And when he starts to talk about the issue of how humans can communicate with each other, he makes reference to a very well documented and respected study that took place in Mexico in the 1970s. And again, there was I forget his name, but a very well respected Mexican psychologist, and he performed a study where he had two people who had no familial relation. They weren't friends, they weren't cousins, brothers, they were two complete strangers. And he put both of them in two rooms, separated by approximately 100 meters. And in one room, he had a screen, and he on the screen, he flashed images of shapes and colors to the individual in that room. And the individual in that room then started to communicate telepathically with the mind of the individual in the room 100 meters away. And what the study found was that the information that was being shown to the person in, let's call it room A, was exactly the information that the person in room B described and was able to draw. Now, when Mr. Goswami heard about this, he was, as he talked about in the documentary, a little bit skeptical. So he flew down to Mexico City to actually see this for himself. And he went to this guy's lab, and in the documentary he says he observed exactly this. And one of the criticisms that the scientific community has made about the field of what they refer to as parapsychology, meaning that it's not really psychology, it's a form of psychology. One of their biggest criticisms has been the non-reproducibility of these studies. Well, in this case, the Mexican psychologist was able, on at least 13 or 14 occasions, to replicate exactly the same findings. Mr. Goswami, after he had witnessed it for himself, says in the video he wasn't surprised that people are able to communicate telepathically, and that's something that I had read about many years ago in a book called The Evolution of the Mind, and it was about how humans are moving towards and into an era where we're going to be using words in an increasingly reduced fashion. And what's interesting, actually, if you look at teenagers today, they're sitting there on their digital devices, communicating, sending emails and texts, and then generally you don't see them engaging too much in conversation. So the use of words in the verbal format, is definitely decreasing. And the reason that people would give now is because it's of digital technology. However, the mind itself is moving towards a point where the 90% that people say is not used, the frequent expression, we only use 10% of our minds, well, that means that 90% has been sitting dormant for a very long period of time, but is now beginning to wake up. And as it does, these aspects of mental function will become very apparent. And I think that telepathy is definitely one of them. And again, as I say, I don't have a crystal ball, and I'll definitely be revisiting this issue, but mark my words, 10 years from now, there are going to be forms of communication that will be forms of telepathic communication, maybe augmented by certain devices invented by our good friend Google. So I'd like to thank you for listening, and I'm Dr. Richard Kaul. Thank you.